Hi everyone, welcome to my channel and to this full-length real-time demo where I'll be testing out the Earthberry Clouds set. I recently made a review video on these, so do check that out. But this demo also gives you the opportunity to work along with me from beginning to end, step by step, through an entire painting. So if you enjoy this here, then please do hit the subscribe button here on YouTube. Also, check me out over on Patreon, where I've got my full library of real-time tutorials. You'll notice that I have two very similar demos sitting here. And yes, I did paint it twice. The first time I painted the ship with a light colored seal, so I changed my photo reference and I really tried to just use the Earthberry set. And then after I'd painted it, I kind of regretted changing the color of the seal. So I decided to do another version and I painted this one, which is closer to my photo reference. And I just added in a couple of dark reds from the rest of my collection. But the problem was, once I'd painted both of them, I really wasn't sure which one I actually like. So interestingly, I put this up for my patrons to decide first of all. So I asked my patrons over on Patreon which one they preferred. I think the majority of people said the light colored seal, but there were such interesting thoughts and comments that they gave me that I decided to also put it out on my social media. So I asked my followers on Facebook and on Instagram which one they preferred. And it's been so interesting over the last couple of days to read everyone's comments, because I think it really depends on your mood, or I'm not sure, someone even mentioned that it seemed like a bit of a personality test. But I got such varied responses and such strong reactions to either one or the other from a lot of people. So in the end, what felt like a bit of a painting failure for me turned into a very interesting experiment. So for the purposes of today's demo, I am going to share the one with the light colored seal with you. So I'm going to go through this one step by step. You'll get the full demo. If you really prefer the red one, I've decided to also put this one out on my Patreon channel. So I'm going to release both really. But today we're going to focus on the light colored seal, as that seems to be the one that the majority of people liked better for some reason. So let's give you a bit of extra information if you are going to work along with me. The piece is 10 by 10 inches. I kept it pretty small so that it would be quick to work on, but you could work bigger if you want. I'm working on the light brown color of pastel matte paper, but again, you could use a different paper to work along with me. Here is the photo reference on screen if you simply want to screenshot that. But I'm going to put the photo reference publicly available for download over on my Patreon. So follow the link in my description. It's open to everyone. You don't have to sign up to Patreon. And while you're there, you can also download the materials list from the same link if you want. Now, obviously, I'm using the Earthberry Clouds set of 30 pastels for this, as that's kind of the whole point of my demo, to try them out. But you could absolutely substitute for different colors that you already have. Like with all of my demos, you can work along with different materials. But that's enough talking. Let's make a start. So the first thing I decided to do was get a few colours blocked in. Try and get a bit of the paper covered in with some of these lovely earthberry colours. You can see the very useful shape that they are. I do like the rectangular shaped pastels. I also use Terry Ludwig's, which are a nice rectangular shape. And of course, as you would expect, that's quite a useful shape for making certain types of marks. It's nice for when you're using the pastels on their sides, like I am during the beginning of this demo. So it's always great when you want to block in a larger area. The soft pastels are so versatile. You can make these big broad marks, but then as you'll see throughout the painting, there's a range of marks that you can get from any pastel stick. And I also like to create most of my detail with the soft pastel sticks as well. So that first colour that I was using, I might as well tell you a few of the actual numbers of the colours that I'm using. I picked up a colour which is number 121 for the top blue on the sky. This is number 116. These are all coming from the Earthberry Clouds set, of course. Now the issue that I had, which I have anytime I'm trying out a new pastel brand, is that I just didn't know how these pastels were going to apply to the paper. Sometimes, which if you've tried soft pastel before, you'll know that sometimes when you have a pastel stick in your hand, it can look a certain value, but then when you actually put it on the paper, it can surprise you. It can look either darker or lighter than what you were expecting. So that's what I found throughout this little painting. And there were several times, like right now, where I would change my mind on a value and come back in over the top of that with something else. So a lot of that was to do with the fact that I'm just not familiar with these pastels. I'm not familiar with these particular colors, and you know, if I'm working with a pastel brand that I use all the time, I know those colors inside out and I know exactly what value they are. I know how they look when I apply them to a light colored paper, a dark colored paper. You just become familiar with your color selection. So as I expect, it's always a little bit of trial and error when I'm working with new materials. But at the same time, that's actually quite useful because it's one of the things you're going to do with soft pastel, layering up the colours, mixing them together. And for me, this was a great little test just to see how the pastels behaved when I apply them over the top of each other, when I try to mix them together. It gave me a really good feel for all of that. So I darkened that bottom section of the sky. And then I'm adding a bit more of a minty blue to the top of the sky there. That's a really nice colour in the set. It's number 186 if you are working along with the same colours. And then we've got this little strip of lighter coloured water down here. So without really blending anything just yet, I'm testing out the values here. I'm just getting a bit of colour on the paper. So this darker value that I'm coming in with is number 87. And this is quite a lovely green blue. So from my set, I made use of about 13 or 14 of the colours, I believe. So not even half of the colours in the set. I really tried to keep this quite a limited palette and to just make sure that the colours I did choose work really harmoniously together. And that's the nice thing about having an artist curated set like this. They've usually done a very nice job of choosing a selection of colours that you can really mix and match. And no matter what combination you use from within the set, you should get a pretty harmonious outcome. So at this point, I just, using my fingertips, give everything a good rub into the paper. And I am a bit of a blender. I don't always blend when I'm painting landscapes, But in this one, I actually do. I do blend a lot in this one. I was really interested to see how the pigment would fill the paper. I found that it was really nice and soft. The pastels are nice and soft and they apply easily, but they're not so soft that you get too much pigment on the paper, therefore filling the paper a bit too soon. For me personally, the Sennelier pastels would be one example of this. The Schminky pastels as well. I know these brands are really beautiful and a lot of artists absolutely love them. But for me, they're just a little bit too soft for my liking. I tend to make use of Unisons. They would be my favourite. And I love the Terry Ludwigs. And a lot of other brands too. The Richardson pastels, Art Spectrum. We're really spoiled for choice these days. There are so many wonderful pastel brands. And I'm always excited to try a new brand when it comes out. So I would put the Earthberries in a similar category to the other brands that I do actually like in terms of their softness and their texture. They're perhaps just a little bit softer than the Unison pastels, but not by much. They're pretty similar to that. So here I'm just using the shapes of the sticks. This one is number 46, a very nice pinky peach colour. And I'm just using the edges of the sticks to kind of shape these bigger bands of clouds. The very nice thing I find about working on a smaller demo like this is that I can really let go of the idea that this needs to be exactly like my photo reference. I really enjoy taking a step away from being ruled by photorealism, as I sometimes am in my other work. In these smaller studies, quite often I don't have quite enough space to add as much detail as I normally would, and that kind of frees me up to just play a little bit more and to not worry so much if it turns out exactly like the reference. So I start to layer up some colours within the clouds. I'm now trying out this really nice violet colour. This one's number 5. And I'm adding my marks first. And rather than just leaving my marks like a lot of artists will, I'm coming back in and blending and softening to get that really wispy, dreamy looking cloud. So there's no right or wrong, I find. There's a lot of artists who don't blend at all. They just use their pastel sticks to create the marks and they leave all of their marks showing. Sometimes I will work like this, but as I said, I'm also quite a blender. And for wispy clouds, I really like the effect of mixing those colours together and creating a really soft appearance. And that's kind of what I was going for with this image. It's quite a dreamlike image to begin with. So in my set, I didn't have exactly the colours that I'm seeing in my reference. My idea for this reference was to substitute for whatever I have that's close in this set. So it won't turn out exactly like my reference because I don't have exactly the colours that I'm seeing. But from looking at the set, I figured I've got enough colours here that are pretty close. And of course, we've got some particularly dark areas on the boat itself. And I did bring in one extra pastel stick in this piece. And you'll see that when I start to work on the boat, but that will be a black hard pastel. And apart from that, I decided to make use of just the Earthberry set for this one. If you go and have a look at my other version of this demo with the red seal, of course there's no red in this set. Technically it is a set designed for painting just clouds, so I kind of felt like I was already pushing it a little bit to try and create this whole scene from what is essentially just a clouds set. But you'll see in my red seal version that I pick up a couple of dark red Terry Ludwigs. But apart from that, both versions are pretty much done with just the Earthberry set. So let's get the moon blocked in. And the first thing I do is to pick up some of those warm tones from the clouds. So numbers 46 and 56 going on there, just to create a bit of glow around the edges of the moon. And actually, I probably could have left the moon a more pinky kind of colour. That might have been nice as well. But I decided to make it glow just a little bit more like it does in the photo reference. So this is a very light kind of ivory colour, number 297. And this is the lightest value in the set, in fact. So I'm leaving a little bit of the peachy colour around the outer edge and just putting this brightest value in the centre, letting those edges glow a little bit. So this was the beginning of trying to create something that has to have more of an edge to it, so more of a definite shape. And I found that the sticks were pretty good for that. I can use the corners and the edges of the sticks. And I was able to control that quite easily. So I'm just softening the edges a little bit. Creates just a little bit of a glow around the edges. And then of course it's always possible to come back in with some of the blue sky colours from behind and just clean up a little bit. The same applies for the clouds. So I can always come back in with those first couple of blues that I used on the sky. And I can create some crisp edges on certain parts of the clouds or just clean up some areas. But at this stage, I decide to get some of the hills in the background in the distance here blocked in. Initially, I've picked up number 114. And I say initially because this is a little area that I do change my mind on a little bit. And you'll see in just a moment that I do bring in another lilac colour as well. So I really couldn't decide what to do with this area because I decided to not include what I can see in the photo reference, to instead go for some very distant, dreamy looking hills. And normally I would just be choosing a kind of dusky blue colour for this. And I experimented with a couple of different colours first of all, so this technically is not what I end up going with in the end. I'm now bringing in the lilac colour that I've added up in the clouds. So I did a bit later change my mind on this area, and I darkened this whole strip of hills just a little bit using the slightly darker 115, so a darker blue, which will come into the painting in just a little while. But it's good to know that you can change your mind with these pastels, because that is something you want to be able to do. You're not always going to get the value of something correct first time. Sometimes you put a colour down and it takes a while before you come back to it and decide that it's not quite right, it's not quite the effect that you want. And with your pastels, a bit like with other mediums like oil paint, where you can just paint over the top of something, you can very easily change your mind. So I also want to be able to do that with soft pastel. I want to, within reason, be able to layer colours over the top to go in a different direction, to change my mind about something. So I'm not always layering colours up for a particular effect. Sometimes I'm layering colours because I've changed my mind on something, where I decide I want to go lighter or darker in a certain area. So this blue that I'm bringing in on the water is the darkest value in the set. And you'll see that pop up more and more throughout the painting as I realise more of it is needed. So I've gone back up to the hills here, and I'm starting to think that perhaps I need to darken them even more, and that they're too warm in value, so I've gone with that lilac colour. So here I'm just adding a little bit of darkness right along the horizon line, mixing some of this blue up into the hills. But again, these pastels are new to me. I wasn't too sure of the values that I've got in this set. And sometimes you don't know until you start to put them down on the paper. And that's what was happening here for sure. So I had figured out that this one is my darkest value. This one is number 115. And I decide to bring a bit more of that stronger, darker value into the painting. So I'm adding it up into the clouds here, even though the clouds are pretty muted in the photo reference. But I've made the decision to not make the other colours in the reference quite as strong. So along the horizon line, the land that we can see in the photo reference, I had decided to change that into distant hills and just simplify that to help the boat stand out, and also just to simplify it for this little demo, just for the purposes of this demo. For this version, I had also decided to make the sail on the boat a lighter tone rather than going with the deep red. And initially that decision was pretty much entirely based on the idea that I just wanted to make use of the Earthberry set for the complete painting rather than picking up other colours. But I realised as I was doing that how much I was actually changing the mood of the image. So part of my decision to bring some of that darker colour up into the clouds was in thinking that the whole thing could end up looking quite wishy-washy, quite flat. So bit by bit, every time I come back to these distant hills, I make them a little bit darker. I get there in the end though. And I'm sure that happens you guys as well. Sometimes when you're working on something, you become a bit blinded by it. It's very hard to see a thing as you're working on it. When I sit here to do the audio over the top of this footage, I can clearly see the things that I should have been doing. Now that I have a bit of distance from the painting, now that I have a different perspective on it. But when you're doing it in the moment and you're up close to the painting and you're focused and concentrating, it's very easy to just go off down the wrong path and not really see that, not really see it as it's happening. So take lots of breaks, step away from your painting. I'm always mentioning the fact that I have a mirror hanging on the wall directly behind me. So even if I don't want to get up and walk away from the painting and take a break, I can just spin around in my seat and have a little glance at the painting in the mirror. That does two things. It gives me extra distance away from the painting, and it flips it as well, which is another quite useful thing. Sometimes that can really point out something that needs to be adjusted. So this darkest value, bringing it on down the painting now. And this is really how I start to plan for all of these lovely ripples and reflections in the water. It's one of my favourite types of water to paint, where we get just a little bit of movement and it creates this lovely rippled effect where we get reflections from the boat, but also from the sky as well. So you get a mixture of all of the colours in the top half of the painting, usually all reflecting down through the water. So you can see that I'm making my marks pretty horizontally towards the top part of the water. And then as I come down towards the foreground, we're going just a little bit more of an angle, more of a diagonal. And if you look at the photo reference, you do get a sense of that. And later on, when I start to bring in some of the lighter reflected colours on the surface of the water, following all of these lines will really help me to get the perspective and the sense of distance across the surface of the water, hopefully. And then, of course, another thing that I will have to keep in mind is if I'm changing something that is above the water, I also have to consider changing that in the water reflection as well. So, as I've mentioned, I'm changing the colour of the sail on the boat. And of course, we get that big impact of the red colour coming right down in the reflections in the water too. So all of that must change as well, and of course we'll come to that in just a little while. I leave the boat for now because the very stark black colours that I'm going to use on the boat to bring the masts and all of the little lines for the sails, it would be better if I've got the sky done underneath, because I can, at the moment, I can just smudge right across those lines and I can create the effect of the sky going nice and seamlessly behind the boat. So it's always good if you've got something in the foreground of a painting that you can get the background done first, and then adding those lines for the masts and all the detail on the boat. It'll really give the impression that the boat is sitting in front of the sky and the hills. So that is what I would normally do. I would normally get background things worked first and kind of work my way from background to foreground in the painting. So I go back up to the clouds now, because I do want to quite soon get some of the dark colours blocked in on the boat so that I can start to see how the darkest values in the painting are going to look. So I really need to do a bit more work on these clouds. Here I am bringing in a little bit of the peachy colour. I'm kind of just scumbling that colour over the top of the blue sky here, right down at the bottom at this first cloud. I'm wanting to mix a bit of that peach tone into the blue. And I was pleased with the way these pastels allowed me to do that. If I use a very light touch, I can just add a little hint of the colour. So you still see the colour underneath, and I can mix it just very gently, everything with a very light touch. And I can let all of those colours shine through. So this is what I would normally do, and it was quite a good test for these pastels just to see if I could control them. So if I lean heavier with the pastel, I'll get a much more solid and opaque mark. But if I lean really lightly, it's almost like you're glazing the colours over the top of each other. And of course, with a good pastel brand, I want all of that. I'm greedy. I want it to be able to do everything. So in these moments, I was able to see just how possible it is to create smaller details, i.e. to get in around the little corners and edges of a cloud. And I've got a relatively good amount of control with these sticks. As I mentioned, my favourite pastel sticks are probably still the unisons that I use in a lot of my work. And strangely, they don't have the rectangular shape. They're a rounded stick. And weirdly, it seems counterintuitive, but for me, I tend to find it easier to get detailed and more controlled marks using a round stick. It's something about the way the stick breaks down, so the way it wears around the edges. I find it better, especially if I'm painting animals, for example, because quite often I'll need some kind of detailed marks, and they may be little curved marks to depict fur, for example. And I usually find the round-edged sticks are a bit better for this, and I like the way they break down. But then I've also been mentioning Terry Ludwig's, and of course they're a little bit more similar to this shape. So you've got the squared off edges, the rectangular shape. And what I find those particularly nice for is making bolder marks. So using the stick on its edge. And I feel like these are probably a similar kind of idea. So I would probably say that these are really nicely designed for, in particular, painting landscapes. So I'm bringing some of these darker blues in over the top now, because although I often work from dark to light, sometimes you get things that are layered up a bit differently. So you can see in the photo reference that some of these darker clouds seem to sit in front of the warmer coloured, lighter clouds behind. So I'm following the general shapes that I can see in my photo reference. I'm not going to be too concerned about making this sky look photorealistically accurate to my photo reference. I'm basically just using it as a guide. And I'm softening all of my marks, kind of mixing the colours while at the same time softening the edges of the clouds, especially the smaller, more wispy shaped clouds. And then, as I said almost right at the start of this, I'm still making decisions about my values. So here I'm just mixing in another bit of darker blue along this bottom section of the sky. And even though I've got several layers of pastel pigment already here, it's still allowing me to add more pigment on top. Now, part of that is to do with the fact that I'm using pastel matte. And if you've used Clairefontaine pastel matte before, you'll know that it's a pretty good paper at taking multiple layers of pigment. It will allow you to keep adding more pigment on top. You should be able to add it pretty cleanly, several layers worth of pigment. And of course, you'll notice that it gets a little bit easier with each new layer to mix it into the layer underneath. So at this point, I'm bringing in this really lovely color. This is number 66. We've got a more dusky pink glow coming out from the bottom of this cloud. And so I'm running this right along the bottom here. So I love how dusky a lot of the color choices in this set are. I think my photo reference is a little bit more vibrant when it comes to the pinks, but I knew that I could substitute for the peachy kind of dusky pink colors that you get in this set. I knew that they would work for this, even if they're not exactly like the reference. So if you're working along and you don't have this same set to work along with, you should be able to see by this point that it's really not too important that you have exactly the same colours. I mean, I don't have exactly the same colours as I can see in my reference image. And it's possible to make lots of substitutions as long as I'm using something close to the right kind of tonal value. It should work. So you have lots of options for what other colours you could substitute in here. Perhaps if you're painting along, you will go for those vibrant pinks a little bit more. But instead, I am bringing more of this deeper value. It's number 66. And I'm bringing more of that up into my clouds at the top. So it's not what I can see in the reference exactly, but it should also work. So this is pretty much all I am doing for the next few moments. Just starting to refine some of the clouds.
A lot of the time I'm adding a slightly deeper value towards the base of the cloud and coming in with my lighter value along the top edge of the cloud. Not always, but that's the general thing that I'm seeing happening here on the clouds. And for many clouds, unless you've got, for example, a setting sun that is below the clouds, then it might actually be lighting up all of the base of the clouds. But in this case, the majority of them are slightly lighter towards the top. So I'll spend just another few moments on the sky, and then I will make a start on the dark values on the boat. So at this point, I decide to get some of the dark black areas blocked in on the boat. I've got enough of the sky done now, I think, that I can add some of this over the top and cutting up into the clouds. And what I'm using here is a black new pastel stick. So this is a much harder type of pastel. I don't use many hard pastels, in fact, pretty much just a black. So when I need something that is particularly dark, I really like to pick up the harder black pastel because one, it happens to be a bit darker than some of the soft pastels in black. And two, it's a bit less messy to work with. So when I'm adding a lot of black pigment somewhere, the last thing I want is a lot of loose pastel dust falling over the rest of the painting. So I've usually got a bit more control with this harder black stick. Again, if you don't have the new pastel stick, there are many different brands with a hard black pastel. So an extremely tricky part here, and I did actually mess it up a little bit, this first mast on the ship. And I actually decided to pick up a smaller piece of my black pastel just because I've got a bit more control with that little piece than with a big fresh piece of it. And part of my problem here is due to filming myself painting, because of course my camera sits to the left side of me, and I always tend to end up sitting slightly off to the right of my painting. And it makes getting little precise lines like this rather difficult. If I was doing this without the camera in the way, I would get myself positioned over to the left of the painting and really control these marks. But as it is, I manage okay. So I'm just trying to find a little edge on the pastel stick, and you can see here that I'm a bit blind here. I can't actually see where I'm going to make contact with the paper because I'm sitting to the wrong side of my painting as a right-handed person. And that's literally just because I'm filming. This happens to me sometimes when I go to add very fine details. I realize that the camera setup is kind of in my way. So you can make life easier for yourself and really get a better view of where your pastel stick is making contact with the paper. But I get it on there close enough, and I'm just adding all of the little poles that I can see. Excuse my lack of knowledge when it comes to sailing. I don't know all of the exact terminology for this. I'm sure some of you will. In fact, I had someone comment that on this type of boat, technically it should actually have a red coloured sail like it does in my photo reference. But of course, we've got artistic license to play with. So for the purposes of this demo, I was happy enough to change the colour of the sail and not be absolutely correct. So just while I have the black pastel in hand, I'm continuing some of the darker value down into the water. We've got some darker bits of ripples and reflection happening around the base of the boat. Some of the dark windows on the cabin will reflect down here as well, but of course the main dark reflection is coming from those two very tall masts. And of course, my plan to change the colour of the seal, it kind of changes a lot. It changes the whole reflection in the water as well. So where we've got the mast on the left reflecting in the water, this is quite a dark, solid shape when you get the red of the seal beside it. Whereas in this version, it's going to look quite different. So this is always the thing when you make changes in a photo reference that you're painting. Sometimes it's hard to consider the impact of it before you actually do it. And especially when there's something like reflections, you have to remember to change that value in all of the places that it is applicable within the image. So it may have also been nice to make use of a dark value that isn't black. And if you have a look at my other version of this painting with the red seal, I actually made use of another dark Terry Ludwig colour. It's a very, very rich, dark eggplant colour. It's close to black, but it's got more warmth in it. And so for the boat in that version, instead of using pure black, which can sometimes deaden a painting a little bit, I used that dark eggplant colour, and then I used a very dark Terry Ludwig red for the seal. So it gives a slightly different effect. But in this one, I just thought I would go with the black stick because I have the hard pastel version of that, which of course that gives me a little bit more control with my darkest value, and to hopefully not mess any of that black pigment over these other lighter colours. So it's a lovely mixture of colours within the water. I'm bringing in some of this more blue-green kind of colour. This is again number 87. And between that and my other darkest blue from the set, that's really creating the whole base for the water. Then after that we will bring in all of the lighter reflected colours. There's a lot of that dusky pink colour in the water as well. And I feel like it really comes to life when you start to add some of the lighter reflected colours. So at this stage I decide to get some of the sail blocked in. I'm picking up quite a pale lilac blue here. This is number 33. And I'm just working that one around the edges of the sail. And you can see there it's possible to make a bit of a mess as I do, and then I smudge that with an even messier fingertip. And I've left all of this in because I think it's interesting to see when I've got to do a bit of cleaning up, as often happens, and how it's possible to just add a bit more pigment over the top and just very carefully then, with a clean fingertip this time, just very carefully blend that back in. So it was a pretty delicate operation to try and block in the sail because you've got all of these little pointed corners. And again, just get yourself into a position where you can really see where the pastel is making contact with your paper. That's the key here. If you're making something very precise, You don't necessarily have to pick up pastel pencil for that, although sometimes I do. But you can also just make sure that you've got a good view of where the pastel is making contact. And take your time, really slow your process down when you're trying to add little tiny details on something. So I find that I was a bit messy here because of my position, just sitting always to the wrong side of my painting when I'm filming. But I feel like that also serves a purpose because you get to see when I make a little bit of a mess somewhere, just how it's possible to clean that up and have another go at something. So I'm getting to the point now where I'm trying to add a few little bits of detail on the boat. So something I will also pick up will be a little bit of black pastel pencil, which you will see. For some of these smaller black details, it's a good idea to have some black pastel pencil as well. And of course, you could also be working a bit bigger than me. If you're working on a larger scale, you'll have more space to work with here. You'll have a bit more surface area to create these smaller details on the boat. And when you zoom in on the photo reference, there is a bit more detail there if you want to add it. You can see lots of little people on the deck. But the whole reason for me keeping this one small is so that I don't get carried away with lots of detail. Sometimes working small for me is the key. If I make it impossible to add the details, that is sometimes the way to go. So at first, I thought that it might be nice to bring some warm colour into the sail, like the moonlight casting some warmth here. This is an idea that I pretty quickly scrapped. So I'm bringing in some of the lighter pink colour from the clouds there. And the thing is, I can try this out and I can change my mind and change the colour value. I know already that the colours do layer up quite nicely and that I can add another colour over the top. But for some reason, my first instinct was to go with a warm value on the sail. Then I'm just blocking in the little cabin on the deck of the boat here. So a lot of those same colours that I used in the sky, those are the colours that are reflecting. In fact, the cabin of the boat is a pretty good marker for me in terms of the white sail as well, because obviously the cabin is white. However, it's not looking white in the reference because of the lighting. So instead I've got like a lilac tone just around the corner of the cabin where it's more in the shadows. And then I'm using that lovely almost minty colour from the sky. And I'm just trying to bring that across the boat a little bit, just pick out a few extra little details using those colours. But at this stage, I think I was already starting to regret making the sail a lighter colour. And sometimes, although it's possible to change your mind and add a colour over the top of another one, red happens to be a very tricky colour to work with. It's a very strong colour. So if you're trying to cover over red with another colour, it's extremely difficult. And then I really thought that if I tried to make the sail dark red at this moment, it would just end up mixing with the colour that I have down there, and it would probably turn more of a deep pink. And I didn't really want that either. So at this stage, I'm already thinking that maybe the dark red sail would have been better, but I feel committed to it now. And so I carry on. So I start to think about what I can do to the sail to make it stand out a bit less. And now I'm considering what I will do with the reflection that comes from that sail. So the first colour choice for the reflection in the water is the pale blue-violet colour that I used first on the sail. This is number 33. And as you can see, when we have the ripples further away, so closer to the boat, further away from us, they're all much closer together, so you see more of a solid colour back there. And then as we come down into the foreground, we get more space between the ripples. So there's a lot of little things you can do when you're painting water to give the impression of the distance, the depth within the painting. But I'm pretty much just looking at everywhere that I'm seeing the deep red and making a direct substitution for this lighter value of reflection. So I'm actually really surprised that a lot of you chose the lighter coloured sail in the end, because certainly as I was painting this one, I was really regretting changing the colour of the sail. I just didn't feel like this was going to work out. So at this point I decide to try and get a bit more of the water worked all around that main bit of reflection, because we've got lots of colours coming through the water and they're all going to be colours from the sky mostly. So the reflections of the clouds in the water is one of the reasons I chose to paint this. Even though I'm demoing a clouds set, I kind of glanced at this image and thought, well, we've got all of the colours of the clouds down below in the water as well. So I should have almost enough colours to do this. So way back here in the distance, all of the marks that I make, They're horizontal, but they're also quite short, so smaller marks to indicate that we're further away. And that's a useful test for the pastel sticks. Can I create lots of these little pretty fine lines, ranging from very tiny ones far away, and the marks getting longer in length as we come towards the foreground. So this is number 66. A moment ago I'm using number 2. Both quite similar colours that are going to appear a lot throughout the water's reflections, because we've almost got as much of the pink colour reflecting on the water as we do have the lovely rich blue colours. You can really find any colour within water if you've got reflections like this. You've got to treat it a little bit like it's a big mirrored object. It's just showing all of the colours from all around the scene. But it's really these little horizontal marks that tend to give the flat surface effect of the water. And the flatter your water is, so the less ripples, the more straight these lines will be. If you've got a little bit of movement in the water, then you'll get a little bit more movement in your lines as well. But it's really this dusky pink colour that I've used up in the clouds that seems to be spot on for these warm reflections in the water. And then I'm being careful as I come down towards the immediate foreground to just angle my marks slightly so it starts to go in a more diagonal direction, you'll notice in the foreground. And that really helps to make you feel like you are in the foreground. The ripples down there are broader as they come closer to you, whereas away back here in the distance, it's just tiny little dashes of colour. So I've still got a lot to add here, but you start to see it resemble some reflective water quite quickly when you start doing this. And of course, some of those pink reflections are cutting right through the lighter reflection belonging to the seal. So I really love to paint water reflections. It's such an effective illusion to try and create. And for me, the soft pastel as a medium is just perfect for this. You can add such strong colours over the top of each other, and you can blend to soften the whole thing and really give it that glassy appearance. You can see that each time I blend, I'm blending in the same direction that I'm making my marks. And it's important to do that. So I'm not blending vertically. I'm not rubbing the marks up and down. I'm really stretching the marks out horizontally with my blending as well. And just remember to get smaller with the marks as you go further away. So there's really just a few important elements to remember when you're painting water to help you create that illusion. So I've added a lot of that dusky pink colour because I'm seeing that right across the whole piece. And then you can always come back in with more of the blues or some darker colours in around that. Here I've got my darkest blue value. This is number 115. And I think one of the main problems perhaps that I had with this piece was in trying to do it with just this set of colours. I realised that perhaps I was lacking a few darker values. And this is a really lovely set, but it's probably not designed to paint something that is a moonlit scene where you might expect to see some darker values. So this being my darkest value within the set, I'm adding some of that back into the water. And I suppose I really just had to embrace the idea that I'm going for a slightly more dreamy appearance to my image. But I did like how these reflected colours on the water were starting to tie that part of the painting together. At least I was beginning to like how the water and the sky were reacting to each other. I still had a problem with the sail on the boat, and of course the hills in the distance there as well. I hadn't gone back to those yet, but I certainly had a problem with them. Sometimes it's good to just work on at the rest of the painting. The more you get worked, the more you get in, the more you can kind of see what changes need to be made. So sometimes just leaving a part of it alone and work on at another section, sometimes just filling in the rest of those gaps can really help to see what you need to do. So I decided to get the reflection of the moon placed. As always with reflections below, just make sure that you line it up with whatever's casting this reflected light. So make sure it comes down directly below. And the same with the sail and the masts. Everything should line up with its reflection. So this is number 46. There's not too much reflection in the water from the moon. It's quite subtle. And now the first bit of pastel pencil. Perhaps I could have used pastel pencil for the masts and the other fine poles in the first place. Maybe that's something you'll want to do, make use of a little bit more pastel pencil for these dark areas. So I can just clean up some edges here, strengthen some of the poles like this one. Add some windows on the little cabin. Again, because of the scale that I chose to work in, there's only so much detail that I can actually add, and sometimes that's a good thing. This is where it's quite useful to step away from the piece and have a look at it from a distance. Often when I'm up close to things like this, it may not look so great, but when I step back, then things sometimes just click into place. And quite often you don't really need as much detail as you thought. So I'm just lining up some of those darker reflections there, coming from either dark windows or just some of the things that are up on the deck of the boat. In the version with the red seal, of course, we get a lot more depth in the reflections down below because things are darker on the boat. And now to add some of the rigging, very fine little lines. And again, I am using pastel pencil for this. I'm not trying to add them in heavily. I'm trying to barely make them visible. They don't need to be too dark because, of course, the boat is quite far away, so we can't see them too strongly. But they were certainly quite tricky to add. So here again, I just wanted to show you that you can undo and go again. And sometimes that requires bringing in just a little bit of pigment and then blending that with ideally with a clean fingertip. And you can pretty much disappear some of those early lines and have another go. So I'm just trying to figure out what angle to go at here. Maybe from the bottom is better. Either way, it was extremely tricky, but I did my best to get them on there reasonably smoothly. And then we've got extra lines to add over here. Again, I don't have to add them very boldly. They can just be a faint hint, and that is kind of enough. So a good sharp pastel pencil is good for this. And just while I've got the sharp pastel pencil in my hand, I'm just adding a little railing around the edge of the boat. So just a few hints at the details here and there is enough, hopefully, to bring it together. So I was happy enough with the overall appearance of the boat at this stage, but what was still bothering me now was some of the values of certain things. So the hills behind the boat, the sail of the boat. These are all things now that I need to adjust and then to continue adding more reflections and details to the foreground water. But we were getting there. It was starting to come together. So the first thing that I start to do to adjust the overall colour of the sail is to bring in a little bit of this slightly darker violet colour. This is number 5. You can see that I've used this up in the clouds. At the moment it's still one of the colours on the hills behind the boat. But I decide to darken the sail just a little bit. I've still got that light pale pink colour on the sail, which it will disappear soon, but I still haven't really figured out that that needs to happen. I think at some point I go away and have a little break and come back and make a few important decisions. Sometimes you just need to look at it with fresh eyes. I often get really stumped when I'm painting landscapes especially, and I just can't see where it's going anymore. But sometimes a break is exactly what you need, just to give yourself that fresh perspective of it again. So anything that I do to the seal must happen down below as well. And often it's a good idea to go even just a little bit darker in the reflected colours, because often the colour within its reflection will be a step darker. So I've just swapped to this slightly darker pink colour. This is number 46. And I'm bringing a little bit of that up through. This is before I've decided to change the colour of the seal to go a little bit darker and less pink. So first of all, I'm bringing in this pink colour because of the seal. And then you'll see later on that I do change my mind. And it's absolutely fine to do that, because I can go over all of these marks. So this is the darkest blue value again. And then this colour that's slightly more blue-green, number 87. A really lovely palette of colours. I really like how all of these colours work together. I may not have chosen the absolute best reference image to demo this set, but I really do love the palette of colours. This palette was put together by a very nice landscape artist called Valerie McKeehan. And I definitely recommend going and checking out some of her work. She's chosen some lovely selections of colours for this brand of pastel. So finally, I figured out that I need to darken these hills behind just a little bit. So I'm coming in here over the top of the whole thing with my darkest blue value. And that's number 115. Finally, just killing off that pinky violet colour that just isn't working back there. And just simplifying the hills overall, just making one shape, leaving it really simple. Initially, I had thought perhaps I would create a few layers of hills back here, which you could do, just to create a bit more distance there. But at this stage, I just decide to simplify, because there's enough going on in the foreground. And on this scale of demo, sometimes if you're trying to create extra detail way back here at the horizon line, it just feels like a struggle because it's so small. So I was much happier now just to knock that colour down a bit, make it darker. And I think that is definitely one of the adjustments I made that were a result of having a little break and then coming back to this with a bit of fresh perspective. So I work on now at the water for a little while. The next few minutes are all about the water. The more of these little dashes and horizontal marks that I can make, the more texture along the surface of the water I can create. And I'm working now at bringing lots of the other colours into the water as well. So lots of the colours that are in the sky, this lovely blue-violet colour. Everything that's in the sky is reflecting down below. And I basically just spend a good few minutes now adding lots and lots of these little marks, building up the layers. So I'll join you again in the narration when I finally finally decide what to do with that really bright coloured sail. So we are pretty close to the end of the painting, and it really took me until now to decide that I've got to do something with this bright, warm coloured seal. And I take just a moment with the slightly darker violet colour. This is number 5. And I'm just going to darken down the seal to begin with, and then choose a different highlight colour for the seal, because I'm just not enjoying that light pale pink colour as the highlight. Just doesn't make sense to me if the white coloured cabin is shades of blue in this moonlight, then why would the seal be shining a more warm pink tone? Perhaps it would because it's up in the light is shining through it. But instead, I think it was a better choice to darken it slightly. And then I'm using this colour as the highlight colour. This is number 186. It's been used right across the painting. It was one of the blues in the sky. It's been used on the little cabin below. And I felt like as soon as I started to put this on, it just worked a little bit better. Now I feel like I could have still gone a bit darker with the seal, but I was at least happier with a cooler colour on the highlights. And then of course, what's up above must be down below in the reflections. And it's not a problem at this stage to just go over any of those bright pink bits of reflection in the water. I'm just changing those, bringing in more of this kind of aqua minty blue colour. And in general, just bringing a bit more of that colour down through the water. But the main thing here is to cover over any of those light pink bits of reflection which are coming from the seal, because we've got rid of all the light pink on the seal. And I feel like this just tones it down slightly. I feel that it doesn't compete quite as much with the moonlight and with the reflection coming from the moonlight. That was a comment from quite a few people, that perhaps the lighter coloured seal and its reflection, it competes a little bit too much with the moon. So darkening it down slightly, and perhaps I could have even gone a bit darker, slightly more darker blue tone. But at the same time, I still wanted the reflection of the seal to stand out nicely in the water. Going with an even deeper blue, perhaps I would have lost that reflection. There are so many options when you're painting something. And I kind of felt like the red version of this worked in its own way as well. A lot of the comments that I got online were about how each of them just has a different mood. A lot of people kind of commented that they didn't think that one was better than the other, that they're given a different vibe or a different mood. And I really liked that. I liked how just changing the colour of the seal and its reflection created a very different feeling to the painting. So if you've been painting along with me, I hope that you've really enjoyed this process. Perhaps it's your first time using soft pastels. And I hope that with the guidance here that you've managed to create something that you can feel happy with. It's one of those demos that I've made where I don't necessarily do everything right first time. I had a little bit of figuring out to do in this one, partly because the materials are new to me, so I haven't used these pastels before. And then partly because I decided to make some wacky changes to my photo reference, and sometimes that doesn't always go to plan. But I hope that you've managed to stick with me and see this through to a nice outcome. So I'm kind of on to finishing touches at the minute. Just looking across the water, can I add in more little bits of texture across the ripples? And the part of the painting that I ended up really liking actually was how the water turned out here in the foreground. I always love painting that effect where you've got these reflected colours cutting down through the ripples, and at the same time you're trying to create what you know is a flat surface. So it may have ripples, but it's a pretty flat surface that we've got here. But of course, the main purpose of this demo was to try out the Earthberry Pastels for the first time. I may not have given myself the absolute best image to test this set with. Perhaps there was something simpler that I could have done. But this one really spoke to me, and I'm so glad that I did try the two versions of this, as I have found it really, really interesting to hear everyone's take on it. Don't forget, if you have some thoughts on which colour version of this works better, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I found it absolutely fascinating to hear everyone's ideas. And I think that's the fantastic thing about art. It draws on our mood, our emotions, even just sometimes the type of personality that we have will affect our taste. But I certainly enjoyed using the Earthberry pastels. I feel like what I got from this was that I like the texture of them. I like how they apply to the paper. They're quite a pleasing shape of pastel stick to use, and I can imagine if you're painting more loose styles of landscape that these might be really nice. As I mentioned in my review video of these pastels, I like how the company have added a light fast rating on each pastel colour. However, one thing I will say is it's quite annoying in the world of soft pastel as a medium because there isn't really a standardised rating system for light fastness. So although it's great that they have conducted their own experiments and they've told us this rating out of 3 stars for each colour, I'm still not really clear on how that compares to other brands, and especially other brands that have been around for longer. So some of the really high quality brands that I use in my work, Unison, Terry Ludwig, for example, they have actually been tested over years of use by many artists, and although there isn't a standardized system for this, we do have more data and more information to go on when it comes to the light fastness of them, because they've been compared to a lot of other brands over the years. So it is something I wish that soft pastel as a medium would work on developing, that someone would bring in a standardized system that we can compare all of the brands. So this is just one thing I'm unsure about when it comes to the Earthberries. How well their light fastness stands up against other brands at a similar price range. But certainly if you have been fancying some of their delicious looking colour sets, I can say with confidence that they're very nice to use. And you can see here I'm just trying to add a final little touch with the tiny flag at the top of this mast. So it's always a good sign if you can add a very tiny detail using a pastel stick. They're soft, but they're not so soft that they crumble when you try to use a little edge or a corner of the stick. So just a few finishing touches. I decided to come back up to the clouds here and add just a few more of these pink coloured wispy clouds up in the top part of the sky. Just little things that I see when I step back to look at the painting as a whole. But if you have worked along with me on this, I would love to see some of your versions. Maybe you've decided to make the seal a completely different colour from me, neither white or red. And if you do post your renditions of this image online, be sure to tag me. I always love to see that. I really hope that you enjoyed this real-time demo here on YouTube. I do have lots of other real-time demos here on my channel if you like to work along step by step. And then after that, if you want even more, do check me out over on Patreon, where I've got a huge library of this style of demo to work along with. I'll add the links to that in the description below. And then lastly, do you have a preference between the two seal colours? Which one did you prefer? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this in the comments below. But thanks very much to Earthberry for sending me this lovely box of pastels to try. I've really enjoyed them. And thanks very much to you guys for watching this here. Until next time, happy pasteling.